My sister-in-law was mid-laugh when I walked through the front door of my parents' bakery. The laugh died in her throat. My brother turned around. Neither of them had seen me coming, and that was entirely by design. My name is Claire. I'm 32, the older daughter, the one who figures things out. I'm a certified public accountant. I live by spreadsheets and quarterly filings and a color-coded calendar that my college roommate once described as a cry for help in Google format. I bill my time in 15-minute increments. I wake up at 5 in the morning not because I want to, but because the math of my life only works if I start before everyone else does. I was raised in flour dust and early mornings. My parents, Helen and Robert, opened a small bakery in our neighborhood when I was 7 years old. It was never glamorous. It was a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign, a back kitchen that smelled like butter and cinnamon, and a display case that my mother polished every single morning before the sun came up. They poured everything into that place. Their savings, their 20s, their 30s, their knees. When the 2008 crash hit, they took out a second mortgage to keep the ovens running. When the pandemic came, they pivoted to delivery, and my father drove orders himself at 61 years old with a bad hip. That bakery was not just a business. It was the physical proof that two people had worked themselves to the bone for something that belonged to them. Last spring, my parents announced they were retiring. Dad's hip had gotten worse. Mom's hands hurt in the mornings now. They were 68 and 66, and they had earned every second of rest they were about to take. The plan was simple. They would sign the business over to me, I would find a buyer or a manager, and the proceeds would fund their retirement. Except I had a different plan, a better one. I had been quietly working on it for 8 months. My parents had always dreamed of a small place in Asheville, North Carolina. Mountain air, a porch, somewhere that didn't smell like commercial yeast. I found a renovated craftsman cottage 40 minutes outside the city. 2 bedrooms, a wood-burning fireplace, a vegetable garden already planted in the backyard, and a view of the Blue Ridge that made you feel like the rest of the world had simply agreed to leave you alone. The asking price was $312,000. I had been saving since I was 24. I had lived in apartments with broken radiators and secondhand furniture, and I had never once complained because I always knew what I was saving toward, even before I knew exactly what it was. I bought the cottage outright, cash purchase, their names on the deed, structured through a revocable living trust that I had an estate attorney draft specifically to prevent any future complications. I also set aside a separate account for property taxes and HOA fees for the next 15 years. I did not tell my brother. My brother, Danny, is 3 years younger than me. He is charming in the way that certain people are charming, which is to say that his charm has always cost other people money. When he was 22, my parents co-signed a lease on an apartment for him. When he was 26, they lent him $18,000 for a food truck that he sold 8 months later because, and I quote, the hours weren't sustainable. When he was 29, his wife, Renee, convinced him to start an online vintage clothing resale business, and somehow my parents ended up funding their inventory. I know this because I was the one who helped my mother do her taxes that year and saw the transfers myself. I never said anything. I paid for my own graduate school, my own bar prep, my own everything, and I told myself it was fine. That families carry each other. That Danny would eventually find his footing. I was wrong about the last part. When I told my parents about the cottage 6 weeks before their retirement date, my mother sat down at the kitchen table and covered her mouth with both hands. My father walked to the window and looked out at the backyard for a long time without saying anything. When he finally turned around, his eyes were red. He said, "Claire, you didn't have to do that." And I said, "I know, Dad. That's the point." We drove up to Asheville together the following weekend. Mom stood on the porch in the afternoon light and said it looked like a painting she'd been trying to remember her whole life. I stayed 2 nights to make sure the heat worked, and the water pressure was right, and that the neighbors were the quiet kind. Then I drove back to Charlotte to close out the quarter. I should tell you what I did not anticipate. I did not anticipate that Danny would call my mother 3 days after they moved in and ask for their new address. Mom, being mom, texted him a photo of the front porch. It had the house number clearly visible above the door. By the following Thursday, Danny and Renee had driven up with their 2 daughters, a portable speaker, and approximately 9 bags of luggage. Mom called me that evening. Her voice had that particular quality it gets when she is trying to sound casual about something that is not casual at all. Danny and Renee stopped by, she said. They love the cottage. They're going to stay through the weekend to help us settle in. I said, "Mom, you've been there a week. You're already settled." She said, "Well, it's just a few days, honey," which was her way of saying, "Please come." I drove up Saturday morning. I brought coffee and a box of her favorite lemon shortbread from a bakery I'd passed on the way in. I pulled up the gravel driveway and saw Danny's SUV parked directly in front of the cottage, blocking my parents' car entirely. The front door was open. I could hear Renee's voice from the porch, loud and bright the way she gets when she's performing contentment for an audience. I walked in. My mother was in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. My father was in the armchair in the corner, and he had the expression I know from the worst years of the bakery, the tight jaw, and the very still eyes that mean he is holding something in very carefully. Danny was standing in the center of the living room in his socks, explaining something with large hand gestures. Renee was on the couch with her feet tucked under her, looking at her phone. Danny saw me and grinned. "Claire, perfect timing. We were just talking about the cottage." "Were you?" I said. "Yeah." He spread his arms out like he was presenting a prize. "So here's the thing. Renee and I have been talking, and honestly, this place is way too much for Mom and Dad to manage long term, right? The garden alone, and the driveway in winter." "The driveway is flat," I said. He kept going. "And with property values in this area the way they are, it honestly doesn't make sense for them to just be sitting on this asset when we could be generating income." Renee found a property management company that could list it on short-term rental platforms. We'd handle everything. Mom and Dad wouldn't have to lift a finger. I looked at my father. His jaw was working. "And where would Mom and Dad live?" I said, "while their home is being rented out." Renee looked up from her phone for the first time. "They could stay with us. We have the guest room. It would be like a permanent family visit." She smiled at my mother. "You'd love it, Helen. The girls adore you." My mother said nothing. She looked at her mug. Something inside me went still and quiet. I have been an accountant for 9 years. I have sat across from people who were hiding money, people who were lying about deductions, people who had constructed elaborate financial fictions and expected me to validate them with my signature. I have learned that the most effective response to that particular kind of audacity is not anger. It is precision. I set the lemon shortbread on the kitchen counter. I put down my coffee. I opened my bag. "Danny," I said, "come sit down." He sat, still smiling, because he thought this was the beginning of a negotiation. I placed the first document on the coffee table. "This is the deed to this property. It was recorded with Buncombe County 8 weeks ago. The owners of record are Helen and Robert, held in the Helen and Robert Family Living Trust. I am the successor trustee." Danny leaned forward and squinted at it. "Okay, but as a family trust, that means—" "It means," I said, "that this property is legally theirs, not the family's, theirs. As in, your name does not appear anywhere on this document." Renee uncurled from the couch. "Okay, but you bought this with family money." "I bought this with my money," I said. "Money I earned and saved. You're welcome to see my tax returns." Danny's smile had started to fade at the edges. "Claire, we're not trying to take anything. We're trying to help." I placed the second document on the table. It was a printout of a text message thread. His text messages. Specifically, a thread between Danny and Renee from the previous Tuesday in which Renee had written, "The Asheville place could bring in $4,500 a month easy on a short-term platform. We just need to get Helen to agree before Claire finds out." The room went very quiet. My father stood up. Renee's face went a shade I had not seen on a person before. "Where did you get that?" "You texted it to Danny," I said. "Danny's phone backs up to a family cloud account that my mother pays for and that I help her manage." I paused. "You should use a separate account for things you'd rather not have read." That was a private conversation. Her voice was sharp now, the performance of warmth entirely gone. "I agree," I said. "It's also evidence of intent, which is relevant to what I'm about to explain." I placed the third document on the table. It was a one-page summary I had prepared that morning. "As successor trustee, I have a fiduciary obligation to protect the assets of this trust and to act in the best interest of the beneficiaries, who are Mom and Dad. Any attempt to transfer, encumber, rent, or otherwise leverage this property without their freely given and legally documented consent, and mine is a violation of the trust instrument and potentially actionable under North Carolina law." Danny stood up. He was doing the thing he does when he's cornered, which is to make himself physically larger, like that changes the math. "You are unbelievable. You know that? We are trying to help them, and you're treating us like criminals. You drafted a plan to move our parents out of their home and profit from it," I said before the furniture was even arranged. "That is not help, Danny." "It's family," he said. "This is a family asset." "Say that one more time," my father said from the corner. Everyone looked at him. He had not raised his voice. Robert, who once worked a double shift at the bakery with a fractured wrist because they couldn't afford to close, who drove delivery orders in a pandemic, who cried exactly twice in my memory, once when his own father died, and once when I graduated, was standing very still by the armchair and looking at his son with an expression I had never seen on his face before. "This is not a family asset," my father said. "Your sister bought this house. With her money. For your mother and me. You had nothing to do with it." Danny opened his mouth. "Don't," my father said. I placed the final document on the table. It was a printed screenshot of a draft listing Renee had already created on a short-term rental platform. She had used photos my mother had posted on Facebook the previous week. The listing title was Cozy Blue Ridge Craftsman, Sleep 6, Pet Friendly. It had been saved as a draft but not yet published. Renee looked at it. Then she looked at me. It was just a draft. "I know," I said. "It's still on the platform's servers with her account information attached." One call to their fraud department, explaining that the property owner did not authorize this listing, would be an interesting afternoon for everyone. The room was so quiet, I could hear the wind against the windows. "Here's what is going to happen," I said. My voice was the voice I use in depositions. "You are going to delete that listing. You are going to gather your things. You are going to apologize to Mom and Dad for coming into their home and attempting to take it from them before they'd finished unpacking. And then you are going to leave." Renee laughed, the brittle kind. "Or what, Claire? You're going to sue your own brother?" "I'm going to do my job as trustee," I said, "which requires me to document all of this, report the attempted unauthorized listing to the rental platform, and file the appropriate notices with the county. After that, any future attempt to access this property without my parents' explicit invitation will be considered trespassing under North Carolina statute." I looked at her steadily. "I've already drafted the letter. I can send it from here if you'd like." My mother set down her mug. She looked at my brother with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has loved someone difficult for a very long time. "Daniel," she said, which is the name she uses when she is not performing warmth either. "Your sister bought us a home. Go." It took 90 minutes. Renee spent 40 of them making comments under her breath while repacking the 9 bags. Danny tried twice to corner me in the kitchen, once to tell me I was destroying the family, and once to tell me I had always been controlling. I didn't respond to either. I sat at the kitchen table with my mother, and we drank coffee, and I watched the bird feeder in the backyard and waited. My father sat on the porch the entire time, looking at the mountain view, not saying a word to either of them. When their SUV finally reversed out of the driveway, my mother exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that has been waiting years to happen. I found out later, when I went to make up the guest room, that Renee had left a notebook on the nightstand. It was one of those cloth-covered planning notebooks, and she had been using it to sketch out a business model. There were occupancy projections, seasonal pricing tiers, and a note in the margin that read, "Helen will be easier to convince without Claire there. Work on her separately first." I photographed every page and put the notebook in my bag. Not out of anger. Out of a bit. You keep evidence. You never know when you'll need it. The week after, Danny posted on Facebook a long, vague, wounded thing about family disappointment and people who use money to control others. Several relatives I barely speak to sent me concerned messages. An aunt I hadn't seen since 2019 texted me to say she hoped I would reflect on my choices. I wrote one response, a private message to Danny and Renee with my parents' financial advisor copied in. It was brief. It said that all future communication regarding the cottage or the trust should be directed to me in writing. It said they were formally on notice that unauthorized presence at the property would be treated as trespass. It said nothing else. I did not respond to my aunt. I set up a filter for Danny's email address, and I got back to work. 3 weeks later came the escalation I had been waiting for. My mother called on a Tuesday afternoon. "There's a man at the door," she said. "He says he's a real estate agent. He has a document he says your father signed authorizing a listing evaluation." I asked her to read me the name on the document. She did. I pulled it up in a county database. The agent was real. The authorization was not. My father's signature at the bottom looked nothing like his actual signature, which I have a copy of from 6 different legal documents going back 15 years. I told my mother to close the door politely and not sign anything. I called the real estate agency and spoke to the agent's supervising broker. I explained that the property was held in trust, that no trustee authorization had been given, and that I would be filing a formal complaint with the North Carolina Real Estate Commission if the agent made further contact. The broker was apologetic and horrified. The agent had been told by a family member that the visit was expected. I then sent Danny a text. It was a photograph of the forged signature, alongside a photograph of my father's actual signature from his most recent legal document. Below the 2 images I wrote, "This is forgery. It is a felony in North Carolina. I've already spoken to the broker. If anyone contacts my parents' home representing themselves as authorized by the trust again, my next call will be to the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. He did not respond. The agent did not return. The Facebook post quietly disappeared. What Danny had not understood, what he had perhaps never understood about me, is that I am not emotional in a crisis. I became an accountant because I like problems that have correct answers, and I like finding them. He had spent 32 years watching me be steady and mistaking steadiness for softness. He thought because I had never yelled at him. I was not paying attention. I had been paying attention to everything. 6 weeks passed. My mother called me every Sunday. She told me about the garden, about the neighbors who had brought over a peach cobbler, about a hummingbird that had started visiting the feeder my father hung from the porch eave. She sounded different, lighter, somehow, like a woman who had set down something heavy and was only now noticing how long she'd been carrying it. One Sunday, she said, "I called your brother." My stomach tightened. I told him what he did was wrong. I told him that what he and Renee did to us, coming here like that, planning behind our backs, using my photos without asking, I told him it was a betrayal. And I told him that until he can apologize to your father and to you and mean it, he is not welcome here. She was quiet for a moment. He said I was being manipulated by you. I told him that was not how I raised either of you to speak to me, and I hung up. I didn't say anything for a second. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'm really okay." My father got on the line then, which he rarely does on Sunday calls. He said, "Your brother has a good heart somewhere in him, but we did him a disservice. We never made him face anything. Every time we should have said no, we said let's figure it out. You figured yourself out just fine without us clearing every path." He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry we didn't do that better." I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. I told him the only thing I ever wanted was for him and Mom to have the rest they earned. He said, "We have it." And I believed him. 2 months after the move, I drove up on a Saturday with no agenda, no emergency, no document to deliver, no problem to solve. I brought coffee and more lemon shortbread, and I helped my father put up a second bird feeder because the first one had become what he called a hostile territorial situation with 3 competing cardinals. We ate lunch on the porch. Mom told me about a watercolor class she'd signed up for at the community center in town. Dad said he was thinking about starting a sourdough project, which made us both laugh because he had spent 40 years surrounded by bread and had never once baked a loaf himself. Nobody mentioned Danny. His absence from that afternoon was not a wound. It was weather, a front that had passed through and left the air clean. Before I left, I sat on the porch steps for a while by myself. I looked at the garden and the mountain line and the last of the afternoon light, doing something extraordinary to the leaves. I thought about all the years I had spent transferring money to Danny's accounts, making excuses to myself about why it was the right thing to do, telling myself I was holding the family together when what I was actually doing was holding a leaking bucket and calling it a swimming pool. I thought about my parents at 20-something, standing in front of an empty storefront with a hand-lettered sign, deciding to bet everything on something they loved. I thought about how they had given me the example of what it looks like to build something that lasts. Love is not writing a check because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. It is not absorbing someone's consequences until you've made consequences functionally impossible for them. Love is sometimes the harder thing, the thing that doesn't feel like love in the moment, the locked door that is actually a gift because it forces someone to find their own key. A boundary is not a punishment. It is a description of what is true. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your whole family is to tell the truth out loud, with documents, in a living room, in front of everyone. On my drive home, my niece, Danny's older daughter, who is 14, sent me a text out of nowhere. It said, "The pics Grandma posts of the mountains are really pretty. She seems happy." I sat in a rest stop parking lot and stared at it for a long time. Then I typed back, "She is. You should ask her to show you the garden sometime. She'd love that." A minute later, "Maybe this summer." I put the car in drive and headed back to Charlotte. The road was dark, and the mountains behind me were darker, and somewhere in that little craftsman cottage with the porch light on, my parents were exactly where they were supposed to be. The house was theirs. The peace was theirs. I had given them a gift that had finally been received by the right people. My brother will tell this story differently. He will say his sister is cold, controlling, that she used money to cut him out. Let him. I know what I did, and I know why I did it. I paid off a debt that no child should ever have to carry, and I called it love, which it was. I set a boundary that I should have set a decade ago, and I called it necessary, which it also was. I protected 2 people who spent their whole lives protecting others, and I refused to apologize for it, because some things do not require an apology. The cottage stands. The cameras I installed run 24 hours a day. The trust document sits in a fireproof case in a drawer my father can find without his reading glasses. The garden is coming in, the hummingbirds keep coming back, and my parents are at peace. If you have ever been the one who holds everything together while someone else takes and takes and takes, if you have ever written the check, made the call, absorbed the cost, and told yourself that was what love required, I want you to know something. It isn't. Love is not a blank check. You are not their emergency fund. And the day you finally decide to stop, that is not the end of the family. That is the beginning of something true.